Good morning. I wanted to share some thoughts with you about journalists' use of anonymous sources, which I think is a controversial area and one where you need to do some thinking for yourself about what you think is acceptable. It seems to me there are pros and cons to using anonymous sources. The pros are that granting someone anonymity lets them speak freely on the record, enabling journalists to report and deliver to you some important stories: scandals, crimes, abuses of power, threats to public health or safety, corporate or government corruption, and so on. We can imagine many cases, or at least I can imagine many cases, where employees or confidants or victims might not be willing to be named in the story, but are willing to talk on the record. That might be people who are currently or as children were victims of sexual abuse, people who see their employers engaging in unsafe or illegal activities, like giving or taking bribes, using substandard materials, ignoring health or safety rules, employing unlicensed workers to do a job that requires a license, in some cases pretending to have one business when in fact you're operating another, having a medical practice that's a cover for selling opioids, having a massage parlor that's a base for sex trafficking. There have been cases in the news in the last couple of years involving businesses like that and crimes like that and many others. In addition, I think that there are elected officials who tell lies or say deeply offensive things about rivals, allies, subordinates. And historically, we know that there have been military officers who oversee or tolerate war crimes, racial discrimination, sexual abuse, and so on. I think that these are important stories that need to come to light and that we're all better off if they do. And I think it's fair to say that in many of these cases, if journalists did not agree to protect the identity of certain sources, they wouldn't obtain specific information on stories of public interest and importance. Those are the pros that I see. The cons to the use of anonymous sources is, first of all, if you're not naming the sources, the journalist cannot be held accountable if they misuse or even make up material they attribute to a source. The only real check on this is if colleagues or competitors can demonstrate that the original story is false. Not having to name sources also leaves journalists free to mislead the public about who said what or how important a source said it. Did that quote come from a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or from a sergeant or a civilian clerk who overheard something and maybe understood it and maybe did not? Readers have little basis for assessing the credibility of a source or the accuracy of a statement if they don't know who is speaking. This is really problematic if you're reading an article about an unsafe rail track that led to an accident and someone is quoted anonymously as saying, oh, that's been a well-known problem for years, or well-known danger for years. Well, was that an engineer or a construction worker with some expertise, or is it an untrained employee or a neighbor who witnessed it? We have no way of knowing. The journalist does, but the readers have no way of assessing the credibility. I think that a larger problem, at least in my mind, is that people who know they will be quoted anonymously can be free to misrepresent or even invent facts or situations. A journalist might be duped by a source and then pass on that misleading or inaccurate information to her audience. So it's fair to say that the use of anonymous sources can be abused by the sources themselves when they speak to journalists or by the journalists themselves. My conclusion on the pros versus the cons is that journalists and news organizations need to build a reputation for credibility. That is, they need to earn readers' trust. This sometimes takes time. This sometimes involves explaining to readers and viewers what their policies and standards are and how they reach decisions. I think that in many instances, anonymous sources are essential to getting out stories that are in the public interest and are of great importance. And I'll also say that based on my experience as a journalist and as a consumer of news, I largely trust journalists. I've never been in a situation where I've seen or been in a newsroom where journalists have lied or made up what people said. I think there have been a couple of celebrated cases, and my recollection of them is the journalists were doing this for self-promotion, to making themselves look great. They weren't doing it to get a particular official, and I think it's rare. But what's really important here is you each need to reach your own conclusion about whom and which news organizations you trust. And I think this should be based on informed readership and informed viewership and engagement with the news and with different sources of news. And you need to develop your own standards and decide whom you trust. And of course, that's true in personal relationships, choosing a lawyer, choosing a contractor, an auto mechanic. The same type of judgments that you would make, you need to make about journalists and news organizations. So I hope this is helpful. I'd be happy to hear from you by email, or we could set up sessions if you want to discuss it. Thanks.